very much. Please join me in a prayer, if you would. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
I want to clarify, in case you are wondering, I did not choose this topic. But it seems rather appropriate that it would fall upon me, the token woman in this conference, to defend poor Eve against all of the reputation that she has come to her feet, the wicked temptress, the accomplice of Satan, the destroyer of mankind. Maria Warner, in one of her books, puts it tongue-in-cheek, the fury unleashed against Eve and all her kind is almost flattering. So exaggerated is the picture of woman's fatal and all-powerful charms and men's incapacity to resist. Now, I decided to abord this question with the disputatio method. So I'm going to raise the question, was it Eve? Was it Adam? Was it neither, or was it both? And before I do that, I just want to proceed with one helpful distinction that, to my knowledge, has not really been brought up too much, a little bit, but not with the clarity that I want to bring out, and that is, when we're addressing sin here, there's, of course, the moral sense, and then there's the ontological. We're talking about a lack or a defect, right? Either in the moral sense or also in the ontological sense. And original sin kind of falls somewhere in between all of that, and we'll see how that can get kind of messy when we're raising this question. Because it's a defect when we say, that original justice is not transmitted. We're talking about not really a defect in nature because it doesn't belong to nature per se. But it was to be transmitted by nature, so there's something that is defective in the transmission, right? And then it's not really, it's only analogically, morally black, right? Because when there's a personal sin at the beginning, but anyone who is born into original sin is not culpable, only analogically. So just keep those distinctions in mind as we proceed, because they're not always clear in the argumentation. Okay, so let's begin with the case of Eve. Now, it would seem that Eve is responsible for sin, and this for several reasons. And the first is the scriptural arguments. Now, Adam is cursed on account of Eve. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree, you shall be cursed in the ground because of you. And in 2 Corinthians 11, we read, but I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. In 1 Timothy, Paul shows his misogynist colors when he says, for Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. In short, as Sirach puts it, from a woman sin had its beginning, and because of her, all die. On the second point, it would seem that Eve is guilty because of the fathers of the church. Tertullian, to begin, exhorts women to dress humbly and walk about as Eve, mourning and repentant, in order that by a garb of penitence she might expiate what she derives from Eve, that is, the odium of human perdition. And do you not know that you are each in Eve? He exhorts the women around him. The sentence of God on this sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt must of necessity live too. You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. And then St. John Chrysostom. For the sex is weak and fickle. And he is speaking of the sex collectively. For he says not Eve, but the woman, which is the common name of the whole sex, not her proper name. Was then the whole sex included in the transgression of her fault? As he said of Adam, after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him who was to come, so here the female sex transgressed and not the male. Then there's St. Augustine, writing to a young man by the name of Laetus, who was leaving the monastic life for love of his mother after the death of his father. Augustine recognizes the evil of Eve in every woman. Watch out that she, that is your mother, does not twist and overturn you for the worst. What difference does it make whether it is in a wife or a mother, provided that we nonetheless avoid Eve in every woman? Now, another argument that comes from the fathers, not just that every woman is evil with Eve, is that the weaker sex sinned first. St. Ambrose clouds the distinction between an ontological defect and a moral evil when he says, the sex betrays who can have been the first to err. Unless there be any doubt what he means by the sex, it should be interpreted in the Beauvoirian sense. I quote Simone de Beauvoir. We sometimes say the sex to designate woman. She is the flesh and its delights and its dangers. Now, the third argument that comes from the fathers of the church is portrayed by Justin Martyr, and this is a little more positive, but it's the parallel between Eve and Mary. Eve had to be disobedient because Mary was obedient. Christ was born of a virgin in order that by the same way in which the disobedience caused by the serpent took its beginning, by this way should it also take destruction. For Eve, being a virgin and uncorrupt, conceived the word spoken of the serpent and brought forth disobedience and death. But Mary, the virgin, receiving faith and grace, gave birth to him by whom God destroys both the serpent and the angels. And here we have kind of a parallel with the famous argument of Irenaeus of Lyon. Just as Eve, by disobeying, became the cause of death for herself and the whole human race, so Mary, betrothed to a predestined man and yet a virgin, by obeying, became the cause of salvation for herself and the whole human race. However, as Anne Baring and Jules Cashford argue in their book about the goddesses, Mary's virginity in Christianity cannot redeem the fallen Eve, but only compound the idea that there was a sin in the beginning and that there is something intrinsically wrong in human nature which has to be atoned for. Or, as Marina Varner puts it, as immaculately conceived, the Virgin affirms the inferiority of the human lot. Soaring above men and women who prayed to her, the Virgin conceived without sin underscores, rather than alleviates, the pain and anxiety and accentuates the feeling of sinfulness. Now, still another argument. Let's jump to the medievals. St. Thomas. It would seem that Eve is guilty, and here is why. St. Thomas admits that man's sin is more grievous because he is more perfect than the woman. He's meaning this, of course, in an ontological sense, because woman is the misbegotten man, Nevertheless, and this is where the misogyny really gets, shows a double proportion of misogyny. The man is more perfect, but the woman's sin was more grievous, and this for 3 reasons. Firstly, whereas the woman sought to obtain something against God's will, the man did not. He sought only to attain to God's likeness by his own power. Secondly, the woman sinned not only against God, but also against neighbor, because she encouraged Adam to sin. And thirdly, Adam's sin was diminished by the fact that, as Augustine said, he consented to sin out of a sort of friendly goodwill. Now, let's move on to still some other arguments. These are contemporary. The Society of Biblical Literature argues that Eve is the focus of the story, and therefore she must be guilty. Then there's the question of the association of Eve with sexuality and lust. For as John Phillips puts it, the serpent was regarded consciously or unconsciously as a powerful symbol of the connection between evil and sexuality. The original transgression was seen from a very early date as having something to do with sexual awareness. Eve thus becomes the vehicle for the intrusion of lust into the created order. I'm sorry, I'm making not such good noise here. Thirdly, the purpose of the Genesis myth. Now, Cardinal Ratzinger reminds us that the Genesis myth was written during the time of the cults to the foreign gods that the kings of Israel had fallen into because they had married foreign wives. And within this worship, we have 2 calamities that befall Israel. The first is the dispersal of the 10 tribes of the northern Hebrew kingdom. And the second, of course, is the exile in Babylon. And Israel blames the people's worship to the Canaan goddess and her son Baal that is reflected then in the myth of Eve, who is blamed for the exile from the garden. In fact, the Genesis account took its literary form precisely within the time of the danger of the fertility cults. And you might recall Elijah was the only prophet in Israel up against thousands of prophets against Baal. So Eve becomes the temptress to speak to the people of Israel of the need to turn from the goddess religions. Moreover, the fathers, and this, becomes like a second argument in the same sense, the fathers start to stray into the pagan paths to gather evidence for their case against Eve, namely the capacity of women to succumb to temptation and to place subjective desire before objective command. Both Origen and Tertullian are found associating Eve with Pandora, for example. So, again, in response to all of this, we have men writing the myth that's going to save humanity from the evil woman. And I can't help but cite Simone de Beauvoir on this. Estare, Cybele, were cruel, capricious, lustful, and they were powerful. As much the source of death as of life, in giving birth to men, they made men their slaves. We couldn't be further from the revelation of the Christian God, in whom the cult of the goddesses is definitively reversed. And this is how Beauvoir sees that. For the first time in human history, the mother kneels before her son. She freely accepts her inferiority. This is the supreme masculine victory, consummated in the cult of the Virgin. It is the rehabilitation of woman through the accomplishment of her defeat. The male's point of view is mesmerized into God's viewpoint, writes Mary Daly. And the original sin of women consists in their enforced complicity in oppression, the internalization of guilt and blame. So, from the perspective of the British theologian Tina Beatty, men have put so much intellectual energy into defining the nature of Eve's sin. And Eve must now be refigured so that she can no longer bears the burden of men's ideas of women's sins. Beatty suggests that women need to reclaim Eve as a symbol of women's historical abuse by men. Eve stands in solidarity with every victim of misogyny. She is the patron saint of battered wives, victims of rape, women whose fertility is a misery and a trap. Now, let's go on to sed contra number 4. Eve receives the command secondhand. It is Adam, not Eve, who receives the command from God. Although Eve speaks of the Lord's command as addressed in the plural. In the French Taube edition, because in the English we see you, in the French version we have two forms for the plural and the singular. And there we read, nous, we, pouvons manger du fruit des arbres du jardin. We can eat of the fruit of the garden. Et vous ne mangerez pas, et vous ne toucherez pas, afin de ne pas mourir. Donc it's in the plural. You in the plural, you shall not eat. The command is given to Adam, on the other hand, in the singular. Tu pourras manger du fruit du jardin, mais tu ne mangeras pas de l'arbre de la connaissance. You in the singular. Sed contra 5, I'm sorry, falling back into the French there. Adam was with Eve when the serpent tempted her. Now, she gave some of this to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. I'm on the arguments for Adam, aren't I? I have slipped up. No? Am I still there? Okay. Adam was with Eve. Number 6. There is no moral weight given to Eve's place in Genesis 3 because Yahweh was subject to the Yahwist author was subject to a formal constraint. The Yahwist was subject, so goes the argument, in the Feministische Bibellesung, to an Oriental iconography. Tree and woman, tree and goddess are often linked. And so it just is natural that the woman should be under the tree, and this has nothing to do with a greater affinity between the woman and sin. The combination is value-free. Now we're going to pass to the case for Adam. Now it would seem that Adam was guilty of the sin. For we find in Scripture, as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be alive. 1 Corinthians 15:22. I am messed up on my notes. Well, excuse me, I'll go to the point B. One body, one sin, and that is Adam's. The argument by analogy presupposes a common nature transmitted by a unique head. St. Augustine, for example, argues, we all existed in that one man, since taken together, we were the one man who fell into sin through the woman who was made out of him before sin existed. Although the specific form by which each one of us was to live was not yet created and assigned, our nature was already present in the seed from which we were to spring. And because this nature had been soiled by sin and doomed to death and justly condemned, no man was to be born of man in any other condition. So too for St. Thomas, the whole human race is in Adam as one body in one man. It was suitable for the woman to be made from the man, St. Thomas argues, so as to give the first man a certain dignity consisting in this, that as man is the principle of the whole universe, so as God, is the principle of the whole universe, so the first man in likeness to God was the principle of the whole human race. All men born of Adam, he writes in another question, may be considered as one man, inasmuch as they have one common nature, which they received from their first parent, even as in civil matters, all who are members of one community are reputed as one body, and the whole community as one man. Accordingly, the multitude of men born of Adam are so many members of one body. Now, the action of one member of the body, of the hand, for instance, is voluntary not by the will of the hand, but by the will of the soul, and the first mover of the members. And therefore, a murder which the hand commits would not be imputed as a sin to the hand, but considered by itself as apart from the body, but it is imputed as belonging to the body. And in this man, born of Adam, is voluntary sin not by his will, but by the will of his first parent, who by the movement of generation, and this is the key phrase, by the movement of generation, because woman cannot generate, man generates, moves all who originate from him, even as the soul's will moves all members to their action. The C point, one principle of transmission, Adam. Bonaventure. The argument is simple. Man is to blame because he alone transmits sin in the transmitting of human nature. Since the sin of the man was the cause of the transmission of sin to posterity, the greater corruptions resulted from the sin of man, and in this respect, the blame of the man is said to be greater. St. Thomas. The original sin of all men was in Adam as in its principal cause, according to the words of the apostle, in whom all have sinned, whereas it is in the bodily semen as in its instrumental cause. Again, St. Thomas writes, original sin is transmitted by the first parent insofar as he is the mover and begetter of the children. Wherefore it has been said that as anyone were begotten materially only of human flesh, they would not contract original sin. Therefore, Eve cannot be responsible. Sed contra, the philosophers and the biologists of the time were wrong. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, take a look at the reference that I'm supplied by Isolde Camembert. Now, let's move on. I think we better go on, given the time constraint here, to the fourth point, the case for neither Adam nor Eve. The first argument is one of an allegory. This comes from Augustine, who says the whole story of Adam and Eve is merely an allegory, and this is how he describes it. He, Adam, rules, and she obeys. For it was necessary that virile reason hold subject to itself its animal part, by the help of which it governs the body. The woman was made an illustration of this, for the order of things makes her subject to man. The interior mind, like viral reason, should hold subject the soul's appetite, by means of which we control the members of the body, and by just law it should place a limit upon its helper, just as a man ought to rule woman and ought not to allow her to rule him. Then there's another argument that it could be neither Adam or Eve, and this is the Reformed notion from the Reformed tradition, that is, of alien guilt. There's an argument by Wayne Townsend, a Calvinist, who argues that the scriptural reference to original sin is built on the paradigm of the Leviticus uncleanness, which is a state of being and not a state of purity of heart or a moral state. And in this argument, of course, we come to a height of confusion between an ontological lack and a moral evil. But this is how the story goes. In the fall, there is a pretext for the Exodus conquest built on the Levitical doctrine of uncleanness with the paradigm of original sin. Now, uncleanness is defined as original sin as a culpable state of being for our Protestant brothers and sisters. And these are unclean not because of what they had done, but because of who they are. And the paradigm for this is the Leviticus state of uncleanliness. We take the example of a Nazarite who witnesses a death, and because he just happens to be there when someone dies, he enters into a state of uncleanliness. And he cannot come back to the community until he has made an atonement offering. Another example of this is that any descendant of Aaron who is born with a defect is not considered clean in the sense of being able to offer to enter into the Holy of Holies and to offer sacrifices in the sanctuary. So this idea of alien guilt or guilt by uncleanliness is tied then to the Reformation understanding of original sin as a corruption of all nature. Hence, sin resides not simply in the moral act or the moral nature, but in the whole being of a person. And of course, we're not far from the doctrine of Martin Luther, for whom spiritual powers that we were endowed with at creation, speaking of memory, will, and mind, are in virtue of the fall, and I quote, most depraved and most seriously weakened. Yes, to put it more clearly, they are utterly leprous and unclean. After all, if we were to ascribe to the idea that the powers of nature can bring about something good, we would have the danger that man can cooperate in his own salvation. Hence, fallen man is sinful before he thinks, says, or does anything. What he does flows from what he is. Indeed, he still sins even when he does what is right. Still another argument for alien guilt is the argument that moral value is realized on account of the fall and not given before. In paradise, Adam and Eve are considered innocent, like little children. So Joseph Weiler, for example, from a Kantian reading of the text, akin to what Pinkers would call a morality of indifference, argues that the exile from paradise is an original passage from childhood to adulthood. Eve's act to the fall is an ascent through which our humanness can emerge. It's not a fall, it's a rising to moral heights. When Eve approaches the tree of knowledge, she has potentialities, but these potentialities are not yet realized. It's only through the transgression that creation of man in the image of God is realized with moral agency. Erich Fromm takes a similar position in his book, You Shall Be Like Gods. Adam and Eve are still blind, and their eyes are opened when they acknowledge and receive knowledge of the good and evil. Sed contra, John Paul II writes that the image and likeness of God in man means their freedom. That is, man's use of free will to choose good or his abuse of it to choose evil against the will of God. And by committing sin, man rejects this gift. So now let's pass on to the case for Adam and Eve. One sin, two actors. I would argue, firstly, that the fact that we can find scriptural and patristic arguments for both Adam's case and Eve's case might lead us to conclude that, in fact, both Adam and Eve sinned, and still speak of original sin as one. Let's take a look again at the scriptural references. First of all, in Genesis, Adam was with Eve when she transgressed. Moreover, the Greek noun that's used to describe Eve's sin in 1 Timothy 2:14, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and came into transgression. That's the word, transgression. The same word is used to describe Adam in Romans 5:14. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. Furthermore, Adam, as it is referenced in the text of reference, is male and female. And those text references are Genesis 1:26 and 27. He, Yahweh, created him, male and female, he created them. And then again in Genesis 5:1 through 10, he made him in the image of Elohim, male and female, he created them, blessed them, called their name Adam, and they were created. So it would seem that together they were to obey God, and together they disobeyed. Remember Augustine's argument, for we all existed in that one man. Since taken together, we were the one man who fell into sin through the woman who was made out of him. Then again, St. Thomas' argument for one body, one sin, we might recall that woman, in fact, is presented in the scriptures as man's body. So she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man and they became one flesh. In the same way, Ephesians 5 tells us husbands should love their wives as their body. So we might conclude Eve shares Adam's fault insofar as he is her body. Now, Irenaeus argues along this line. He says that the serpent attacked her as being the weaker of the two, but she appears to have been the helper of the man in the transgression of the command. And in the city of God, we read that their pride seeks to put the blame for the sin on someone else. The pride of the woman blames the serpent, the man blames the woman. So in fact, they're both blameworthy. In the Catechism, we have various references to the original fault freely committed by our first parents, Adam and Eve, who transmitted their descendants by their own first sin. By our first parent's sin, the devil has acquired a certain domination over man. More complex is the statement regarding royal representation of man. By yielding to the tempter, we read in the Catechism, Adam and Eve committed a personal sin, but this sin affected the whole human nature that they would transmit in a fallen state. So it seemed that we have a distinction of rules, but one sin. And I think I gave you a reference there to John Paul II that I'm not going to board right now for a lack of time. But I want to just go on to state that it's really in a unity of Adam and Eve. Let's see, where are we? I guess the biggest text is the proto-evangelium. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. This is the Felix Culpa, O happy fault of Adam, who gained for us so great a Redeemer. Let's look at some of the arguments there. I'm sorry, my notes are different than yours. From St. Augustine, I'm on page 5, the parallel between Christ, Adam, Mary, and the Church. On the one hand, we have that argument, the woman and the serpent. Then we have the text from Ephesians. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will be one flesh. This is the great mystery, and I take it to mean Christ and the church. Now, I don't have time to go through all of the fathers and their arguments. I'm going to leave those for you, and that's why I have such a substantial handout. But I want to bring this to conclusion in light of the time that is limited here. And this is what I would like to say. This is my respondo, if you will, after giving the arguments. Adam and Eve did indeed sin together, which is the reverse side of the mystery of our salvation realized in the form of the covenant, the wedding of the Lamb, and the New Jerusalem descending from heaven like a bride. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now God's presence is with his people, and he will leave them and will be their God. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, sadness, crying, or pain, because all the old ways are gone. That's Revelation 21, 3 through 4. In short, in this statement, we have a reversal of the curse of Adam and Eve and their descendants. And we see that God's intentions are definitively realized. You see, it's not an afterthought that God creates them male and female. As the Alpha and the Omega that he presents himself with in the title of Revelations, we have to believe that God's creative intentions are at work when he says from the beginning, it is not good that man shall be alone. We might say, in fact, that it is in the fullness of time, when God sent forth his Son born of a woman, that we might understand the mystery at the beginning of time, when God created them male and female. And we see this realized at the end of time, with the marriage of the Lamb and the bride. The coming of Christ, I insist, is not a divine afterthought to make up for Adam's mess, but something prepared before the foundation of the earth, Paul tells us in the first chapter of Ephesians. And that is why St. Paul reminds us that the original unity of man and woman at the beginning of time, in Genesis 2:24, is pointing to the great mystery of Christ and the church. It is for this reason, we read in Ephesians, as he quotes for Genesis 2:24. It is for this reason that a man will leave his mother and his father and cling to his wife. Because he made them woman from man's side. And that woman from man's side is Eve, the new Eve, from the side of the new Adam on the tree of life. And the scriptural or the patristic references I have supplied you with. You can take a look at that. They're very abundant, especially in the works of Augustine. This was then to prefigure the divine nuptials. For he came into this world, says St. Augustine in his commentary of the text in John's Gospel of the miracle of Cana. He came into this world for a wedding, that is to say, his own. He does not wed himself in the absence, however, of the bride's response. If Mary is portrayed as the model and mother of the church and the new Eve, it is assuredly in reason of the obedience that St. Irenaeus points out and the Second Vatican Council when it writes, "The Father of mercies willed the incarnation should be preceded by the acceptance of her who was predestined to be the mother of his Son, so that just as woman contributed to death, so also a woman should contribute to life." Now, admittedly, this is the great heresy of Protestantism, as Karl Barth reminds us, and I supplied you with that reference. In the doctrine and worship of Mary, there is disclosed the one heresy of the Roman Catholic Church, which explains the rest. The Mother of God of Roman Catholic Marian dogma is quite simply the principal type and essence of the human creature cooperating, servant-like, in his own redemption. On the basis of prevenient grace, and to that extent, the principal type and essence of the church, end of quote. What is at stake, in fact, is this, that there is the figure of Eve beside Adam at the foot of that faithful tree, is a prefiguration of Mary at the foot of the cross, and of the church kneeling at the altar of our salvation. For as St. Augustine puts it so well, God who created you without you will not save you without you. The Christian cannot remain anesthetized, to quote von Balthasar, while the cancer of his sin is being removed. That is, it is not good that man be alone. Woman must give her response. And that is why God has willed for all eternity that mankind should be wed to his Son. And John Paul II puts it so well when he writes, "In the context of the great mystery of Christ and the church, all are called to respond as a bride with the gift of their lives to the inexpressible gift of the love of Christ, who alone is, as the Redeemer of the world, is the church's bridegroom." Thank you for your attention.